are moments in life that etch themselves into your skin, not just your memory. Moments that don't fade with time but stay sharp, fresh, cutting, like they're still happening, even years later. For me, that moment was at my daughter's high school graduation. The auditorium smelled like fresh flowers, hairspray, and parental pride. Rows of proud mothers in pastel dresses, fathers in button-downs and uncomfortable smiles, teenagers in gowns too big for their shoulders and dreams too big for their town. And in the middle of it all, me. Camera clutched in my hands, heart full, eyes locked on the stage where my daughter, Emily, sat in the third row, grinning from ear to ear, tassel dangling beside her cheek. I had never been prouder of anything in my life. Not my career, not the house I renovated from the studs, not the marriage I spent 17 years building like it was a structure that would hold no matter the storm. Just her, my girl, my reason. My husband, Rick, sat beside me, freshly shaved, tie a little too tight, hands resting casually on his lap. He was calm, distant, too calm for a man watching his only child graduate. Something felt off. I chalked it up to nerves, or maybe nostalgia. Maybe men don't cry at graduations the way mothers do. Maybe that's just how he was built. I had no idea he was sitting there rehearsing a speech in his head, one he'd been perfecting for weeks. The ceremony ended. Cameras flashed. Families cheered. I was crying, mascara running, shouting Emily's name while she waved from the stage. And when she descended the stairs in that awkward, glorious way that only 18-year-olds can, I reached for Rick's hand. But it wasn't there. He had already stood up, turned slightly, looked at me not like a husband, not like a man who had shared a bed and a mortgage and a life, but like a stranger who needed to say something that couldn't wait. "I'm leaving you," he said. Just loud enough, just precise enough, just cruel enough. Right there, right as Emily reached us, grinning like sunshine. Right as the applause still echoed off the auditorium walls. Right as the woman behind me gasped audibly and the man beside her glanced away in embarrassment. My ears rang, my legs buckled, the world blurred, but I didn't scream. Not yet, because something deeper than rage rose in me. Something ancient, cold, sharp-edged and patient. I smiled, I nodded, I hugged my daughter and kissed her cheek. And I waited, because if Rick thought that was the end of our story, if he believed he could humiliate me on the proudest day of my motherhood, he had no idea who he was leaving. He wasn't walking away from a broken wife. He was creating a storm. And soon, he would know exactly what it meant to burn your house down with your own match. People always say the end comes slowly, that it's a quiet unraveling, a death by 1,000 cuts, missed glances, forgotten anniversaries, cold dinners eaten in silence. But with Rick, it didn't feel like that. It felt like standing on solid ground until, one day, the floor just cracked open beneath me and I realized I'd been walking on hollow wood all along. But if I'm being honest, painfully honest, the cracks were always there. Rick and I met when I was 20, pregnant, terrified, and still naive enough to believe that a man who stayed deserved praise simply for not running. He wasn't Emily's father. Not biologically, but he raised her as his own. That was the myth I clung to. The version I repeated to friends, to family, to myself. He was never violent, never cruel in the ways people write about in books or whisper about behind closed doors. He didn't cheat, or if he did, he was too careful for me to find out. He just slowly stopped showing up. He stopped seeing me. He watched me rebuild our kitchen with my own hands and didn't compliment the finish on the cabinets. He watched me work late shifts and drive Emily to rehearsals and fold his laundry and hold it all together, and never once said thank you. He just assumed I would always be there, like the walls of the house, like the roof overhead, reliable, passive, and changing. But I was never passive. I had buried that version of myself, the girl who fought for space in her own home, who swallowed her brilliance for the comfort of a man who dimmed her light. But she had always been there, waiting, breathing beneath the surface. And the thing about betrayal in plain sight is that it's more painful than the kind done in the dark. Rick didn't sneak off. He didn't hide. He made the announcement at the most public, sacred, irreversible moment of our shared history. The day our daughter closed one chapter and opened another. The moment that should have been burned into our hearts as a triumph. He turned it into a battlefield. He didn't even explain. Not really. No, I'm sorry. No, we've grown apart. No mention of counseling or time or pain or blame. Just a flat statement. I'm leaving you, like a transaction, like breaking a lease. As if our marriage were a bad investment he could write off. As if I were just a role he had outgrown. What he didn't know was that I didn't need his apology. I needed justice. And justice, the kind that leaves scars, takes time. The hours that followed the graduation were surreal. Emily floated through them on pure joy, surrounded by classmates and balloons and ice cream and summer plans. She wanted photos with both of us. She wanted a family dinner. She wanted to bask in the light of her achievement. So I smiled. I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. I leaned into Rick like everything was normal while his shoulder barely touched mine. I posed with my daughter in front of her school's fountain, arms around both of them, the photographer saying, "Hold still, one more," while I silently counted the seconds until I could exhale. He didn't even have the decency to hide his phone. I saw the messages, screen tilted slightly, just enough for me to glimpse the name, C. Not a full name, not even a saved contact, just the letter and a string of flirty messages with too many exclamation marks. It was cowardly, even in its boldness. So I didn't say a word. Not then, not in front of Emily. I watched. I memorized. I made mental notes of timestamps and tone, patterns and names. I noted how quickly he texted back when she went to the bathroom, how often he smiled at his phone but hadn't looked at me that way in years. And all the while, I built something. Not revenge. Not yet. A record. A strategy. Plan. Because he thought he was walking away from a powerless woman too stunned to speak. He thought he was the only one who could cause damage. He thought wrong. I've built homes from plaster and ruin. I've rebuilt myself from betrayal before. And if Rick wanted to watch me crumble, he should have known better than to test what happens when a woman has nothing left to lose. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was that the moment he said he was leaving, I had already started preparing for something far more devastating than divorce. I wasn't going to chase him. I was going to dismantle everything he loved, legally, socially, emotionally, while smiling at the camera. The first night he didn't come home, he didn't even bother to lie. No invented late meeting, no vague excuse about car trouble or staying with a friend. Just a message on my phone at 9:48 p.m. "I'll be staying at a hotel for a few days. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Harder than it has to be? I stared at those words until they blurred, like I was the problem, like I was the one dragging something sacred into the dirt. He had detonated our family in the middle of our daughter's milestone moment, and now he wanted me to be polite about the cleanup. For the first few hours, I sat motionless on the living room couch, hands folded in my lap like I was waiting for a funeral to begin. But it wasn't grief I felt. It wasn't even sadness. It was precision, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My emotions narrowed into something cold and useful. Focus. I went into our shared office, opened my laptop, and began collecting data. I wasn't stupid. I'd always known Rick kept separate files, separate cards, separate phone habits. He was discreet enough to avoid suspicion, but careless enough to think I wasn't watching. He'd grown lazy in our routines, leaving things half done, passwords half hidden, messages deleted, but not entirely. And I'd been too busy being dependable to question the inconsistencies. Until now, his personal email, left open one morning when he was rushing out for a meeting, had offered the first thread. I remembered the name, not C, but Claudine, a woman I vaguely recalled from the office holiday party last year. She'd worn a sequin dress too short for the temperature and laughed too loudly at Rick's jokes. I'd filed her away as irrelevant. Turns out, she wasn't. What began as flirtation had escalated into hotel receipts, dinner reservations, even a business trip last fall that I now knew was a romantic weekend in Asheville, complete with photos of the two of them hiking. Rick in a beanie, Claudine in tight leggings and a smug little smirk. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the arrogance, the ease, the total disregard. And worse, he'd used our joint account to fund part of it. I downloaded every receipt, every screenshot, every suspicious transfer. I backed it all up on a private drive. My fingers moved steadily over the keyboard while the rest of me burned. Every dollar he spent on her was one he took from Emily's college fund, from our mortgage, from me. He hadn't just left. He'd siphoned pieces of our life and handed them to someone else with a grin. But I didn't cry. I crafted. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not one of those timid family attorneys who specialize in amicable dissolutions. I called a specialist in high-conflict litigation, a woman named Alondra Reyes, who had a reputation for dismantling smug husbands in polished suits. We met that afternoon. I showed her everything. I didn't hold back. She read quietly, skimming the files, her lips thinning as she flipped each page. "He's not just having an affair," she finally said. "He's building a separate financial life, probably planning to make it look like you are the dependent spouse to force you into a minimal settlement." I nodded. "He thinks I'll fold." She smiled. "Then let's show him what happens when he plays chess with a woman who's already 5 moves ahead." That night, I began phase 2. Emily still didn't know. And I refused to tell her. Not yet. Not until I could do it without it being raw, without letting her see me broken. She deserved the summer she worked so hard for, the joy of her graduation, the freedom of youth. She didn't need to know yet that her father was more actor than man. So I smiled at her, took her out for ice cream, helped her sort through college brochures. And all the while, I was building the case, financial records, hotel bookings, transaction trails, a timeline of lies, and perhaps most importantly, testimonies. It turned out Rick's affair wasn't as secret as he'd thought. Claudine, ever the extrovert, had confided in someone, a co-worker, a friend, someone who found it amusing at first but was more than willing to talk when I reached out, armed with charm and the implication of subpoena. By the end of the week, I had a file thicker than our tax returns, and still he didn't know I knew, because I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him arrogant. I wanted him believing he was still in control. And I wanted to be standing across the room when the ground finally gave out from beneath his feet. He didn't expect me to move first. That was his first mistake. Rick thought I would spiral, thought I'd beg or rage or plead for some kind of reconciliation. He underestimated what happens when a woman like me, forged by disappointment and sharpened by years of silence, finally decides to make noise. And so, as he played house in his hotel room, probably pacing the hallway on phone calls with Claudine, spinning tales about how I was unstable or clingy or made things difficult, I was turning my house into a fortress. I had the locks changed by the second day. Legally permissible, according to Alondra, especially once I filed for exclusive temporary occupancy of the property, and I did that within 72 hours of his text. I left his favorite coat on the porch, folded neatly with a note, "Check your inbox." In it, the official notice that I'd retained legal counsel and initiated proceedings, along with a motion to audit all shared finances dating back 3 years. By the 5th day, his tone changed. He sent a flurry of texts, confused, defensive, indignant. "I thought we were going to handle this maturely. There's no need to make this hostile. You're really going to make Emily's graduation week about lawyers and bank accounts?" But I didn't respond. Not to him. I wasn't interested in a conversation. I was preparing for a reckoning. The next blow came when Alondra filed a temporary injunction to freeze major asset transfers. The moment we suspected he was liquidating or hiding funds, even preemptively, we had the right to stop it, and he was sloppy. His attempt to shift $15,000 to a private brokerage account linked to his sister? Locked. His plan to wire money to a business associate in Florida? Flagged and frozen. He was furious. Not that he said so outright, but I could read it in the way he showed up at the house that Friday, uninvited, puffed up with self-righteousness and false confidence. I saw his car pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. I didn't flinch. I didn't rush to meet him. I let him knock, hard, like he had a right. I opened the door halfway. He had that stiff, patronizing expression he always wore when he thought he was about to talk someone down, the one he used on clients and underpaid contractors. "You've made your point," he said, voice low and clipped. "Can we be civil now?" I didn't answer. I simply handed him a flash drive. It was labeled transparency. Inside, every document I had. Photos, emails, financial trails, and an audio file, a recording provided by the very friend Claudine had bragged to at work. It was short, but damning, her voice saying, "He said once Emily's graduation was over, he'd file the papers. His wife's just the PR problem he has to manage first." I watched his face as it registered. His breath hitched. His eyes darted from mine to the flash drive and back again. "I haven't even started yet," I said, my voice cold and smooth. "But I wanted to give you a courtesy preview of what full disclosure looks like." He started to say something, probably the word lawyer or misunderstanding, but I closed the door gently in his face. Not with anger, with finality. That night, I took Emily out to dinner. Just the two of us. I let her talk about college, her future, her dreams. I laughed when she laughed. I asked about the boy she liked. I cheered when she said she'd gotten a scholarship. It was the happiest I'd seen her in weeks. She didn't know, of course. Not yet. She didn't know that her father had betrayed us, or that I was in the middle of a legal storm. I protected her from that, even as I was building a case that would leave no room for him to manipulate her emotions the way he had mine. Because here's what Rick never understood. This wasn't just a marriage ending. This was a mother making sure her daughter never had to watch a man walk all over her and call it love. I wasn't just preparing to win. I was preparing to annihilate, and soon he'd know what it felt like to be publicly undone, not with rage, not with scandal, but with proof, poise, and precision. The thing about control is that men like Rick believe it's permanent. They think if they've held the upper hand long enough financially, emotionally, socially, it's theirs by right. They believe it's a natural law, like gravity. What they never consider is that some women don't rebel by screaming or throwing dishes. Some of us bide our time. We study the rules. Then we use those rules to burn the whole damn system down. I didn't just want to win in court. I wanted the world to see who he really was. Because Rick didn't just betray me behind closed doors, he humiliated me publicly on the proudest day of my motherhood. So I decided to return the favor. It started with his workplace. Rick had spent the last 12 years building his reputation in commercial real estate solid, clean-cut, dependable. Clients liked him because he wore nice suits and said all the right things, but they didn't know about the fraud just under the surface, the business dinners that were actually dates, the company credit card he used to impress Claudine, the shady backroom deals he'd boasted about to friends when he thought no one was listening. I'd spent nearly 2 decades being the silent wife at those networking events. I remembered things, names, places, transactions. And with the help of Alondra's forensic accountant, I connected the dots between Rick's work expenses and the weekends he was traveling for development deals. He wasn't just having an affair, he was misusing company funds to bankroll it. So I made a call. Not anonymously, not subtly. I requested a meeting with his firm's internal compliance officer. I brought my attorney. I brought the documentation. I brought receipts, time-stamped emails, and itemized breakdowns. And I sat across from the man who had once called me Rick's lovely little wife and let him choke on the weight of what I was about to drop in his lap. It was a corporate bomb. The kind that doesn't explode immediately, but creates deep fractures that grow louder with every tick of the clock. Rick received a notice of suspension 3 days later, pending investigation. The second front in my campaign was social. I didn't need to smear him. I didn't need to lie. I simply stopped covering for him. When friends asked if he was traveling, I answered, no, he's staying with his girlfriend in Midtown. When neighbors asked how we were holding up after graduation, I smiled and said, well, Rick used the occasion to announce he was leaving me, so I'd say it was memorable. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I simply told the truth, and people listened. Because the truth, when delivered calmly and clearly, slices cleaner than gossip ever could. But the most devastating escalation came from the one thing Rick had always counted on me never doing, turning Emily against him. I didn't poison her. I didn't rant. I didn't frame it as betrayal. I showed her facts. One morning, I sat her down at the kitchen table. I had a folder slim, curated, enough to explain but not overwhelm. It included the financial evidence, a printed transcript of Claudine's message, and the screenshot of Rick's hotel booking for the night of graduation. She sat quietly. She didn't cry. She read every page like a scholar studying a tragic novel. Then she folded it all back up and asked, does he even know I saw him looking at her when I was on stage? And just like that, I realized she already knew. Not all of it, but enough. I'm sorry, Em, I said, my voice catching. I tried to protect you from it. I wanted to wait until. She shook her head. You didn't have to. You never did. I've always known you're stronger than him. Now he knows it too. After that, things moved quickly. He called. Desperate. Panicked. The suspension had shaken him. Emily wasn't answering his texts. Claudine had gone quiet, and the court's early rulings were not in his favor. He left a message on my phone at midnight, his voice hoarse, asking if we could talk one-on-one. But I was done talking. He made his choice under the auditorium lights, in front of family, peers, and the one person who had looked at him with pure pride that day, our daughter. He had humiliated me in the open. Now, I was showing him what it looked like when a woman with nothing to lose plays her end game. And I hadn't even drawn blood yet. The day the court granted me temporary exclusive custody of Emily and full control over the marital home, I didn't celebrate. There were no champagne corks, no victorious phone calls. I just sat on the edge of the bathtub, fully clothed, staring at the tiled floor, letting the silence wash over me like a quiet confirmation. You're winning. It wasn't about spite. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. It was about order, truth, restoration. For 17 years, I had built the bones of our family while Rick decorated it with illusion. And now I was carefully pulling out every false panel, every hidden wire, every secret chamber he thought I'd never find. This wasn't destruction. This was renovation. But make no mistake, I was rebuilding it without him. The court order was the first major blow that visibly shook him. Up until then, he still carried the swagger of a man who thought I was acting out of emotion. He believed I'd lose momentum, cry it out, retreat into mediation. He hadn't counted on structure. He hadn't anticipated strategy. When his attorney, a stiff, overconfident man who clearly thought I was another suburban housewife with an Amazon Prime addiction, received the petition and accompanying evidence package, I could almost feel the sudden shift. The next day, Rick's lawyer called Alondra and opened with, perhaps there's a path to compromise. We didn't reply. There would be no compromise. What followed was a string of small, exquisite victories. A court-ordered forensic audit of our shared accounts revealed multiple instances of financial misrepresentation, primarily Rick transferring funds without my consent under falsified business expenses. His firm, under pressure from the looming investigation, placed him on indefinite unpaid leave. Word began to spread in his professional circle. He tried to get ahead of it, of course. He reached out to a mutual friend, claimed I was acting irrational, that I was dragging our daughter into it. But it was too late. I had already gotten ahead of him. See, reputation isn't about spin. It's about foundation, and Rick had built his on a glossy exterior with no core. He thought charm and tailored suits would hold against truth, but truth has a gravity of its own, and it was pulling everything he'd built into collapse. Even Claudine had started to vanish. Alondra had traced a new set of charges: last-minute bookings, vague addresses, transfers out of state. She was distancing herself, sensing the legal exposure. When Rick tried to contact her, she stopped answering. When he went to her workplace, security escorted him out. He was unraveling. The man who had stood beside me at Emily's graduation with smug detachment was now leaving me voicemails in the middle of the night, his voice cracking, asking if we could keep this out of court for Emily's sake. The same man who once whispered about starting fresh with someone younger was now begging to be heard. But I wasn't listening anymore. The final escalation came 2 weeks later, when the court set a hearing date for our preliminary divorce trial and asset division. Alondra delivered the news to his attorney with a simple message: "We're ready." And I was. Because in those weeks, I had quietly gathered everything else I needed: witnesses, financial analysts, even a therapist who had seen Emily and was prepared to testify on her behalf if Rick attempted to challenge custody. We weren't just walking into court. We were walking in with a case that had been sharpened to a blade. And Rick? He was walking in with a crumbling resume, frozen assets, a disgraced lover, and no leverage. The best part? I never raised my voice. I never cursed him out. I never played the hysterical wife he needed me to be to justify his betrayal. I remained calm, composed, dangerous in my stillness, because what Rick failed to grasp is that some storms don't scream. Some storms arrive dressed in silence and deliver devastation with surgical precision. And as I stood on my porch the night before the hearing, watching the wind shift through the trees, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. Not of his lawyers, not of his ego, not of his ghost stories. I wasn't fighting for a marriage. I was executing its last breath. And tomorrow, in court, he would learn exactly what it meant to be left behind, not by the woman he betrayed, but by the woman he never truly knew. The morning of the hearing, I dressed with the kind of deliberate calm reserved for funerals and war. Charcoal gray tailored suit, minimal makeup, pearl earrings Rick had given me for our 10th anniversary, back when he still made gestures that pretended to mean something. Not because I clung to the sentiment, but because I knew he'd notice. Because I wanted him to sit across the courtroom and realize I hadn't broken. I'd refined. When I arrived, the courthouse was already humming with that sterile tension, briefcases clicking against marble, legal pads clutched tight, whispered strategy between tight-lipped attorneys. Alondra walked beside me in heels like weapons, her face composed, her phone in hand. She didn't ask if I was ready. She knew. Rick was already there. He stood near his lawyer, a new one. The previous had dropped out after the internal fraud claims became too real to manage without risking his firm's reputation. This new guy looked younger, hungrier, but rattled. Probably briefed at the last minute, desperate to form a defense from a story with too many holes. Rick tried to catch my eye as I entered. I didn't give him that. We sat, we waited, and then we rose when the judge entered. It began like all proceedings do, formally, slowly, like it wasn't about to rip through the remains of someone's life. Rick's lawyer opened with a plea for discretion, painting their client as cooperative and deeply regretful of the breakdown in communication. He referenced emotional strain, misunderstandings, and a desire to co-parent effectively. I let him finish. Let the polite fiction play out. Then Alondra stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace or gesticulate. She simply unfolded the timeline, the receipts, the evidence. She showed how Rick siphoned over $80,000 from shared accounts over 2 years to support an extramarital affair. She presented photographic and digital documentation of his travel expenses, his alias hotel bookings, even a short, damning clip of Claudine talking about the affair's timeline. She described how the funds were funneled under fraudulent business expenses, how Rick repeatedly violated fiduciary trust, and how he attempted to mislead both his spouse and his employer. Then came the psychological layer. Alondra introduced the court-appointed child psychologist's report, requested as part of our custody filing. It detailed Emily's growing sense of detachment from her father, her awareness of his absence, and the documented emotional distress caused by the graduation incident. Rick's expression shifted slowly during all of this, from performative concern to tightening panic. I watched his hands tremble, watched him lean over to whisper to his lawyer, whose face was hardening by the second. But we weren't finished. Alondra saved the final blow for last, the personal statement I had written, signed, and submitted under oath. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even emotional. It was factual. It outlined 17 years of quiet erosion, of missed birthdays, of forgotten commitments, of emotional neglect masked as marital fatigue. It painted no picture of a monster, just a man who had used his family as a convenience and discarded it the moment it no longer served his image. The courtroom was still when she finished reading. Even the clerk had stopped typing. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. That would come later, but we didn't need it. I had watched Rick unravel in real time, surrounded by the consequences he never believed would touch him. He had expected tears, maybe rage, but he never expected a woman who had turned her heartbreak into a weapon of precision. As we left the courtroom, Rick followed. Landra moved between us, ready to intercept, but I raised my hand. I wanted to hear what he had to say. He caught up to me on the courthouse steps, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched tight. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to plead, maybe to explain the unexplainable, but I beat him to it. You didn't just lose your wife, Rick. You lost the version of me who stayed quiet. He blinked, unsteady. I didn't think you'd go this far. I met his gaze cold and clear. Then you never knew me at all. And I turned away. Because revenge doesn't always come in fire and fury. Sometimes it walks calmly out of a courtroom in heels, holding its head high, knowing the real damage has already been done. Rick's downfall didn't happen in one catastrophic moment. It happened in quiet, consecutive collapses, the kind no one sees coming until the dust is already settled. 2 weeks after the hearing, the first wave of consequences reached his professional life. His firm, already reeling from the fraud inquiry tied to our finances, moved swiftly. They issued a press release clinical, sharp, and final announcing his voluntary resignation amid internal review. No fanfare, no legacy, just silence, a whisper of scandal that spread faster than any PR spin could contain. His clients began pulling contracts. Referrals dried up. Friends from the golf course stopped answering texts. He tried to play it off as a sabbatical, then a transition into consulting, but those closest to him knew, and they began to distance themselves. That's the thing about image. When it crumbles, no one wants to be caught in the rubble. But the professional fallout was nothing compared to what happened between him and Emily. He still tried, still sent messages, clumsily crafted apologies filled with cliches. I never meant to hurt you. This is between your mother and me. Can we meet for coffee? Just us? He even showed up at her dorm unannounced during freshman orientation, holding a bouquet of flowers and a weak smile. But Emily didn't even let him finish his sentence. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She looked him in the eye and said, I watched you ruin her, and you smiled while doing it. Then she turned and walked away. That was when I knew the final thread had snapped. I didn't orchestrate that. I didn't tell her what to say. I didn't manipulate or poison her against him. I simply told her the truth and let her decide what kind of man she wanted in her life. She made the decision on her own. Rick didn't try again after that. Not seriously. The messages slowed. The excuses dried up. Eventually, all that was left was silence. I saw him one more time, months later, outside a grocery store parking lot. He looked older, grayer, his suit didn't quite fit. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and pretended not to. Either way, I didn't stop walking. Because by then, I had no interest in confronting the past. I was too busy building the future. The divorce finalized in under 8 months. Landra's strategy worked flawlessly. We secured the house, full custody, and a financial settlement that made up for every stolen cent. I reinvested part of it into a college fund solely in Emily's name. The rest, I used to renovate literally and figuratively. I gutted the kitchen, tore out the marble Rick had insisted on, knocked down the wall between the dining room and the den. I made space, light, air. Then I turned to myself. I started running again, joined a book club, applied for a nonprofit board position I'd once declined because Rick didn't want me too busy. I painted my bedroom a bold shade of slate blue. I changed my hair, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. And for the first time in years, I exhaled fully. Revenge isn't just about watching someone fall. It's about rising higher than they ever imagined you could. Rick used to say I was resilient, like it was a compliment, like I was a rubber band that would always snap back into place. What he didn't realize is that I never snapped back. I reinvented. And in doing so, I turned his betrayal into my blueprint. He thought the graduation was the end of something. It wasn't. It was the beginning of me. Time does something strange after devastation. It doesn't rush forward like you think it will. It doesn't leap toward healing or drag its feet through grief. It moves quietly, methodically, almost respectfully, letting you feel each second like a bead sliding through your fingers. And before you even realize it, a year has passed, and you're not the same woman who once stood shaking at the edge of everything you thought was permanent. I woke up one morning and realized I hadn't thought of Rick in days. Not in anger, not in sadness, just hadn't thought of him at all. Emily was already gone for her summer internship in DC, thriving in her independence. She called once a week like clockwork, her voice bright, telling me about her supervisor, the coffee place on 11th Street, the roommate who hoarded takeout cartons. Her laughter had weight again, real, full, unguarded. and every time I heard it, I knew we'd done something right. Despite everything, the house was quiet without her, but it wasn't empty. It had become something else, something mine. I'd taken the room Rick once used as his office and transformed it into a creative studio, not for painting or sculpting or anything pretentious, just a space with clean light, tall windows, and the freedom to exist in peace. A chair I actually liked, a wall of books, a large corkboard covered with pinned notes of everything I wanted to do with my life moving forward. Small things, mostly. Simple joys. A road trip to Asheville, taking a photography class, learning how to bake bread without it coming out like a brick. I wasn't rebuilding some grand identity. I was just reclaiming the version of myself that had been shelved for nearly 2 decades. The woman I could have been if I hadn't let a man like Rick shape the perimeter of my life. I still got updates, sometimes, whether I wanted them or not. Mutual acquaintances couldn't help themselves. A comment here, a whisper there. Rick was struggling. His attempt at independent consulting hadn't gone far. His license was under review. Claudine had vanished from social media entirely. Rumor had it she'd relocated to another state and was working under a new name. There was even talk that he'd tried to reach out to her family, but they cut ties too. I didn't feel joy in his ruin. I didn't celebrate it like some gleeful villain watching the hero fall. I simply noted it, like the weather. I had long since learned that revenge isn't satisfaction. Peace is, and I had peace. One evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of red wine, the sun just beginning to sink past the tree line. I thought about how far I'd come since the day in that crowded auditorium, how he'd stripped me bare with a single sentence, "I'm leaving you," and how I'd stood there, holding the weight of it in my chest, refusing to collapse. I remembered how everyone had looked at me that day, unsure whether to be sorry or impressed. How Emily had smiled through it all, never realizing the moment her father shattered the center of our world. I'd held it together not for pride, but for her, because daughters remember how their mothers stand after they've been hit hardest, and I wanted her to remember strength. And now, as the cicadas sang in the heat of summer and the light turned golden across the grass, I felt that strength like an anchor in my chest, unshakable, quiet, whole. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't jaded. I wasn't waiting for anyone to fill the space he'd left behind. There was no space left. I had filled it with myself. The final page of a story doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it comes with stillness. Not dramatic, not loud, just the soft realization that you no longer live inside the storm, but beyond it. It had been 14 months since the divorce was finalized when I saw Rick again. A grocery store parking lot, mid-September, the sky just beginning to give into autumn. I had parked my car, stepped out with my tote bag over one shoulder, and was walking toward the entrance when I heard the door of a silver sedan shut behind me. I knew that sound before I even turned around. He looked older, not just aged, older, weighed down. Thinner, but not in a healthy way. His eyes had that permanent tension of a man living in damage control. The kind of look people get when they've stopped running but haven't quite figured out how to stand still. He wasn't with anyone. No Claudine, no replacement family, just him. He called my name. Not loudly, just enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard. I turned. We stood there for a long second, maybe 3, neither of us speaking. Then he tried to smile. "You look good." I did, but not for him. I nodded. "Thanks. I didn't think I'd run into you here," he said, awkwardly shifting his keys in his hand like a schoolboy. "I moved back into town last month. Smaller place. West Side." I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because none of that information mattered to me. He might as well have been talking about the weather. He cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to reach out, to talk, maybe have coffee." "Why?" I asked, genuinely, not sarcastically, not harsh, just curious. He hesitated. "I guess I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I did it, for not being who you deserved." There was a time I would have given anything to hear those words. But now, they meant nothing. Not because they weren't true, but because I no longer needed them. I had already repaired the damage myself. "You don't owe me an apology, Rick," I said calmly. "You owe it to the version of yourself who thought that leaving your wife on the day of your daughter's graduation would somehow make you freer. Did it?" He looked down. "I didn't think it would end like that," he muttered. "That's the problem," I said. "You thought it would end. But I didn't end. I rebuilt." He nodded slowly. The wind caught his jacket, made it flutter like loose fabric on a flagpole, and for a moment he looked small, smaller than he'd ever looked to me before. He didn't ask about Emily. I noticed that. Maybe he already knew she hadn't returned his messages. Maybe he'd finally understood that love isn't something you get to cash in on after you abandon it. "I won't keep you," he said eventually. "I just wanted you to know I think about it all the time." I gave him a soft smile. Not out of sympathy, out of grace. "That's between you and the mirror." He stepped back, nodded, and walked away. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I went inside, picked up my groceries, eggs, wine, fresh basil, 2 bags of flour for the bread I was learning to perfect, and came home to a house that no longer held echoes of him. Later that night, Emily called. She was excited. She'd just been offered a scholarship extension. She asked if she could bring 2 friends home for Thanksgiving break. She said, "You don't mind, do you, Mom?" As if she didn't know I'd been preparing for this kind of joy for months. "No," I told her. "Bring them. The house is better when it's full." After we hung up, I sat by the window, sipping tea, watching the lights flicker across the yard I'd reclaimed. There was no more need for revenge. No more battles left to fight. The silence I once feared had become sanctuary. The freedom I once thought was punishment had become the most beautiful form of power. Rick had left me at the height of my vulnerability, but he hadn't taken anything I couldn't rebuild. And in his absence, I had created a life so honest, so full, so mine, that not even the shadow of his memory could darken it. That wasn't the end of my story. That was the beginning of everything.